welcome to the IEM. I'm happy to present to you Steve Williams, in case you don't know him yet. We have actually met in an online conference on sonification and sustainability, or any related topics, and it was a very interesting conference, and of course it has to be online because it stops people from traveling. But at that point we got connected, and it was very interesting because I think this kind of electronic music you bring and present today is a bit outside of what usually takes place at the IEM. So I'm happy to and curious about what you will tell us and about the sounds, and I'm sure you can present yourself within the talk much better than me.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, it was actually very nice to, I'm sorry, I've lost my mouse. Yeah, nice to actually connect in person, because I have to say I'm not a big fan of online conferences. It's just I went to one. It was actually a good idea from the sustainability side. Instead of having people travel, they sort of had one hub in Washington DC, one in Sydney, Australia, and one in Cape Town, South Africa. The idea that people could kind of travel to their local regions, but it meant that my paper session was at 6 a.m. Berlin time, which was like part of the Sydney track, and there was 3 people online in the session. So basically the session was just me and the other guy presenting a paper that just chatted for an hour, and I got up at like 5 in the morning for this, but anyway, so I'm glad that there's actually people physically here. We're not a big group, so feel free to, don't wait till the end for questions. Feel free to jump in and ask anything. So I'll give an introduction of myself in a moment, but just sort of where I'm coming from, and a lot of what drives my work is this idea that art of all kinds, including music, has always been about creating connections, and people have been doing that ever since humans have been making art. And also, given the talk is about sound, music, and sustainability, I'm not claiming that music can just magically solve all kinds of problems or solve every problem. But I think it can really help and provide some of the inspiration that we need in the face of apathy. And Billy Bragg, the English folk singer, he started singing a lot of protest songs in the 80s when Margaret Thatcher was closing down all the coal plants and a lot of fights with the unions. A lot of his music is very political, and he talks about how the biggest problems we face is not climate change or sexism or racism, it's apathy. When people just think, okay, everything's screwed, there's no point, I might as well give up. That's the biggest problem we face, and I think that's something where music can really help with. And also remind us of our history, and this is one of the things I think electronic music is a great example for that. Certainly electronic dance music, where techno and house came out of black queer culture in Chicago and Detroit and New York, and that's a lot has kind of been forgotten in sort of the commercialization of dance music, and you can see that in who's on the lineup, who's allowed into the club, who makes those decisions, what does the audience look like, and so it's a nice way to be able to reflect on that. But also, one of the things that really drives me is this idea of how we can actually help reimagine a different future. And I'll talk more about this, but this idea of reimagining, creating something new, creating something different, creating something that has never existed before, that's what artists of all kinds have been doing ever since humans have been putting handprints on the caves tens of thousands of years ago. One other quick thing, I know I speak very quickly and fast, and I just had like a triple latte to get me some energy, so if I'm going too fast, please feel free and I know English is not everyone's native language, so please bear with me with that. So what I'm going to do for this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about my background and my approach to sustainability in music. I'll talk a little bit about how I've been looking at how sound and music and sustainability fit together, kind of more of a theoretical level, and then go into some of the projects, including the one that where I met Katerina online, where I've been bringing those worlds together, and then close with a little bit more on this particular piece, where with the artistic research residency, we talked a little bit about what could these ideas be, and it's kind of coalesced into what I'll play later on tonight, this techno set called We Are But Dust and Shadows, which is a quote from Horace in something BC. And I apologize for being stuck behind here, but the combination of having the HDMI cable and the audio cable means this is the only place the computer can be. So my background, I didn't start in academia. I actually barely graduated high school. The only reason I graduated high school was I had 43% in math, and one of my teachers crossed out 43, wrote 50, put her initials on it, and that's how I graduated high school. It took me 9 years to get my 3-year bachelor's, just because, I don't know. When I was 19, I was very dumb, and I think a lot of 19-year-olds are not necessarily that. I was certainly not focused on the future. So, and also at that time, and I think maybe similar ages to some people here, at that time, for me, changing the world, making the world a better place, that was always someone else. That was Bono, that was Bob Geldof, that was Live Aid, that was the idea that me and what I did for a living could actually help make the world a better place, honestly never occurred to me. And even when I did my MBA, when I eventually finished my degree, it was a management and technology MBA, and we didn't talk about sustainability or anything at all. We had half of one course on business ethics, and that as close as we got to sustainability, and that was in 2001, I guess. So things have changed a little bit. So I spent a lot of time in the technology world, working for a Canadian company that got bought by a French company that got bought by SAP, the massive German company. And I ended up moving from technology into corporate social responsibility. And all of the tools that we made were all data analytics tools. So I was working a lot with data for our corporate customers on financial data, marketing analytics, all those kind of things. But with the CSR, my job was to give our software away to nonprofits around the world. So by the time I left, we were giving away to a couple of thousand a year in 21 countries, so they could use the same software to manage their volunteers, do board of directors reports, do impact reports, track their marketing campaigns, all those kind of things. So it was a lot of fun, but it got me really interested in systems change because I was working with a lot of individual organizations that were doing great work on child poverty, violence against women, food, energy, climate change. But I saw they weren't really making a big impact because they were working on little slices of big systemic problems. So I got very interested in how do these systems change? And that's where I went back to, I did a graduate diploma in social innovation, which is sort of like one half of a master's. And that's where I learned about systems thinking, transition theory, and that was actually my first entry back into kind of real academia because my MBA was very practically focused. Like we talked a little bit about theory, but it was more about consulting projects and contracting, that kind of thing. And then I ended up going back to do my PhD and did my PhD dissertation studying a process called the Energy Futures Lab in Alberta. And Alberta is Canada's Texas. It's where all of our oil and gas comes from. So I was studying a process that brought together 60 people from across the energy system, oil and gas, renewables, First Nations leaders, activists, renewable energy people, municipal, provincial, federal government people. And for a year and a half, they learned about systems thinking, innovation, prototyping, sustainability transition. And my dissertation was really what impact did that actually have? And how do you, and which from a methodological side, how do you actually measure that impact? How do you actually measure the learning that's happened to individuals, how that translates to organizations, how that translates to policy, regulations, social practices, those kind of things. So that was my dissertation. And then I've also focused a lot on justice and transitions, sort of looking at who wins and who loses. You can see the election in the Netherlands just yesterday of what happens when you don't consider these justice elements. People that feel left behind tend to grab on to the leader that will save us, the Trump, Brexit, Gilets Jaunes, AFD, you see it everywhere. So looking a lot at how the inclusivity, and also in a Canadian context, looking a lot at reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So like most colonies, the colonies were there because they had resources to be extracted and sent back to whoever was doing the colonizing. And a lot of that legacy is still present. Where the oil and gas is typically on First Nations land, so they feel the effects, and then the money goes south or to Frankfurt or Hong Kong or Dubai or whatever. I also look a lot. There's questions of evaluation, which I mentioned earlier, and my particular focus is continuing to look at participatory processes. If we want to engage people around transition, how do we actually do that? How do we do that effectively? How do we measure those impacts? So my most recent project I've studied was one called the North Mid Sweden Challenge Lab, where similar kind of thing to the Energy Futures Lab, but this was people across the North Middle Sweden looking at regional industrial transition. So how do we actually transform this whole region in a sustainable way? So I've written a couple of papers on that and just publishing a new one now. And then also techno. So I ended up in Berlin both to work at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies because they were doing that energy transition research. And also Berlin is the world capital of techno, so it's kind of the place for me to be. And that's where I started thinking about really, and also I also do more experimental sound art, but thinking about how to actually bring these different worlds together. I was already doing all the sustainability stuff. I was already doing all this live techno and sound art, but I started thinking about how do I actually bring those things together. And I started relatively simply. I got permission from Bruno Latour's office and John Robinson and Patricia Nance, other academics, to use their lectures on my techno tracks. And that's a fairly simple way, just taking some kind of recording, putting it into a track. But then I started experimenting more with plants on stage that are sending their voltages into the synthesizers, making kick drums from the sound of wind turbines, having dust or air quality, climate change data, bring those into different pieces. But it was done at a very sort of technical level, I guess. Like it was just thrown into the music. And then I really wanted to think about, and that's a lot of my work now, how and why do we bring these together? What does it really mean to connect sustainability and electronic music together? And that's what this next section of the talk is going to be about. Yes. So actually, maybe just so I kind of know. So when I'm talking about electronic music in this context, I'm talking about all genres, but sort of more focused around techno, dance music kind of thing. So is anybody here kind of making that kind of music? In their, right? Okay.
More or less.
More or less? Okay. But something with beats?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, yeah, so we'll talk about that. Yes, it's even the effect of the venues. Like this is not my usual kind of venue for playing a techno set, but but I got to say, I love all the speakers. That was a lot of fun and playing with the patch bay in there. That was great. I think I used every single patch cable I could find in the patch bay there. So that's great. So if we think about electronic music ecosystem, there's a lot of different elements that fit together there, and sustainability could be an element of any of these. Look at a festival, audiences, all those different elements. Those are all kind of like the things in electronic music ecosystem. But then surrounding that, we have all these other elements. We have travel. How are audiences and artists actually getting to festivals? Waste. What actually happens to all of the garbage and the plastic that's generated in venues, energy consumption in clubs, water use, materials that actually go into synthesizers and speakers and mixers and computers and all that kind of thing. Justice elements that I mentioned earlier, looking at who's on the lineup, who gets paid, how much, who makes those decisions. And also this idea, the culture that fits around a lot of these kind of things as well. Because if we think about, I mean, it's not quite the same for a sound artist, but still, even if you're doing experimental music, but definitely if you're a DJ or a live act, a successful artist is one that will play in London on Thursday night, Amsterdam on Friday night, Berlin on Saturday night, and Ibiza on Sunday afternoon. And that's success. And the only way you can do that is EasyJet or Ryanair to fly around. So there's a lot of cultural elements around what does success mean, and that goes to all society as well. Does success mean a big house and 3 cars and two trips to Fiji and all those kind of things? So all of those elements kind of fit around this kind of system. So I kind of knew that already, but I was trying to figure out how do I sort of encapsulate or tease those things apart? Because it is important to think about the water consumption, energy use, waste, travel, all those things are very important. And of course we should think about that in the art space or in music, but that's not really different than any industry should. Like the trucking industry, restaurants, everybody should be thinking about that. So how do we sort of tease apart what are some of the unique things that music can do? So one of the ways that I found helpful with this is my colleague and friend David Meggs in Canada. He's actually got an interesting background. He is a classical pianist and runs an arts festival, and he did his dissertation looking at the instrumental use of the arts and sustainability, where often what happens is climate scientists or sustainability activists say, okay, we need a better message. So let's hire someone to write a sustainability song or a sustainability poster or a sustainability poem or something like that. And the artist is used as a communication tool. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with hiring artists to be a communication tool. Marketing and PR is very important, but most artists don't really think of themselves first as public relations or marketers. They're artists first, and they don't create just to communicate someone else's message. So his dissertation was all about that relationship. But he came up with this idea of 3 different modes of how arts and sustainability can fit together, where mode 1 is greening the sector, just like I mentioned before. And then mode 2 is actually telling a sustainability story. How can we actually tell a sustainability story through art and music? And then mode 3 is reimagine the world. So I mentioned this briefly, and I'm going to go through some examples of those. So greening the sector, as I mentioned, this includes reducing energy, reducing waste, reducing travel emissions, and there's already lots of groups that are working on this. Bye Bye Plastic Foundation based in Amsterdam, they focus on helping clubs and festivals reduce and get rid of single-use plastic. They have I think it's called a green rider. So in addition to your tech rider for a club, you can specify you don't want any disposable plastic in the booth and don't want to have anything there. Clubtopia, based in Berlin, they do energy audits for clubs, so specifically helping them to reduce their energy for lighting and sound systems and so on. Travel Perk is a travel and offsetting company that works specifically with artists and festivals, looking at how do you actually reduce the emissions for travel. Clean Scene is part of the Berlin Club Commission, so they've got a sort of division looking at that. And even at the Amsterdam Dance Event, they had a whole day called AD Green, which I thought was great. But still, everything is, and they have some neat things, like there was a guy that presented making like a bioplastic for vinyl. So you can basically have biodegradable records, which is pretty cool. But still very much focused on that mode 1, so how greening the sector. But I think where we start to get more interesting is then, an example of this. Do any of you know the trade show Super Booth in Berlin? And so if you like these kind of wires and cables, definitely check that out in May. There's like 300 exhibitors and thousands of people that are all talking about this gear. And a couple of years ago, I did surveys for 30 manufacturers on how they think about sustainability. And first I asked, this one's 23. So how much do you think about sustainability? So almost all of them are thinking about sustainability a lot. And then I asked, do the customers ever ask about sustainability? And customers almost never ask about sustainability. So it's an interesting kind of mismatch around that. And thinking a lot about doing different ways of thinking about sustainability. A big one was around end of life and repairs. One of the guys I met said, we make synthesizers for you and your kids and your grandkids. This idea that iPhones are kind of designed to be thrown away or recycled every 18, 24 months. But this stuff will just last. Almost everybody will repair them. And there's a huge secondhand and DIY and hacking and circuit bending kind of market. Mode 2 is really around telling the story. So there's also a lot of groups that are focused on this. Music Declares Emergency is sort of like an open collective where any artist focused mainly on music can sign up and sort of have tags. They sell T-shirts. They really try and get bands, not just electronic music, but of all kinds, to talk more about sustainability. DJs for Climate Action are another collective, an online thing you can sign up. We're trying to actually use DJs that have followings to share sustainability messages, to be able to promote that and talk about that when they're playing. The Digital Festival, just outside Amsterdam, they actually put sustainability right into their tagline. So they're trying to have vegan food, recycling. They were paying for biojet fuel to offset travel and so on, and actually make that right as part of their experience. And One Resilient Earth have a whole course based on what they call transformative festivals. So how can festival space, you've got a few thousand people for a few days that are sharing a space. How can you actually communicate a sustainability message to them based on what's on site and the music and so on, going beyond just having composting and recycling and no plastic and those kind of things. But I think the most interesting and I think most exciting is this idea of reimagining the world. And this is also a connection back to some of my academic work around energy transition, where a lot of that work starts with getting a group of people together like this and say, okay, let's think about what's the vision of a sustainable future. What does a sustainable Graz look like? What does a sustainable neighborhood look like? And it actually becomes quite difficult to really push people to think and really reimagine things differently. So it's very easy to think we can look outside here. Wouldn't it be great if all of the cars we saw were electric cars? All of the motorcycles were electric motorcycles. That's relatively easy to get people to think about. It's harder to get people to think about, why do we need all these vehicles at all? Like, couldn't we actually redesign our cities so we could just walk everywhere? That shouldn't be that hard to imagine, but people, if we think of it where we are now, it's easier to think incrementally, step by step. And this is, I think, really where the power of the arts can come in to reimagine completely different worlds, whole new ways of being, whole new ways of engaging with people, different ways of having community, different ways of cities, different ways of kind of doing everything. So one of the ways that to approach this that I found, and I think, I can't remember if I actually added all the links in the references slide at the end. If not, I can send this out later. But this is a project called Creatures, an EU research project that was led by Joost de Vijvoort and some colleagues at Utrecht University. And they surveyed, I think, over 300 different artistic practices, artistic interventions, artists that were engaging with sustainability in some way. And they tried to think about, okay, how do we actually categorize how those fit together? And they came up with these three broad categories of changing meanings, changing connections, and changing power. And all three of these can connect to what a different future could look like. So changing meaning can be about learning and imagining different futures. Changing connections can be inspiring people to take action, new ways of organizing, new ways of building community. And changing power can actually be empowering people that don't have power or subverting existing power structures. And I'll talk more a little bit about that in a moment. So a paper that I'll talk about in a little bit, we use that framing to kind of examine different case studies. But the reason I put this up here is it's kind of a nice way when I'm doing my work, which is sort of a blend between research, artistic research, and just kind of making music and wanting to make people dance. This is kind of an interesting way for me to think about, okay, what am I actually trying to do with this piece? What do I want to do with this performance? How am I actually trying to approach that? And when we think about power, there's also groups that are looking at that. So Female Pressure, they're based in Frankfurt, I believe. And they did, they basically lobby and do activism for looking at gender representation in the electronic music scene. So this is a study they did back in 2021, looking at gender proportion of festival acts over time. So you can look at this a couple of ways. One, you can say, okay, it's great. Female representation went from 9% to 28% over a number of years. You can tell I failed math. So that's great, but only 28%. But one of the points that they make in the report that's not shown on this is that we have seen a marked increase in a number of non-male DJs and live acts on stage, but the festival organizers, the bookers, the promoters, the agents, the record company people tend still to be straight white male. So there's this kind of thinking about what are those different elements, which is useful to think about back to that first slide with all those dots, looking at how are each one of those changing and how do we actually engage with that? And what would it look like to have a different world where there was much broader representation. Another great example, who was actually here to see Elisa present? She was at the, what was the name of the artistic research festival that was here a couple of months? Right. So she was presenting, she did a talk, actually a couple of talks, and then performed a piece. But she was talking about this piece, The Music of the River, where they actually did a recording, so the violinist there was basically using the river, and the river was kind of blowing the strings, so she was kind of playing with the river. And then the performers on stage had a written score, but also had an earpiece in one ear, so they were hearing recordings of the water. So the musicians were meant to respond to the written score and to the recordings. And what the musicians were hearing, the audience was also hearing field recordings, but the audience was hearing different field recordings than what the musicians were hearing. But what Lisa was looking at is this idea, she called it sentience. So there's been a move over the last 10, 15 years or so to give rights, legal rights enshrined to rivers, to forests, and so on. So different countries have legal protection for rights. Some countries have legal protection for future generations. So she was interested in, well, how do we actually talk? How do we communicate? What is it like for the river? What is it, if the river has rights, is the river alive? How do we talk to that? What would it be like to actually interact with the river? And I thought it was a very interesting way of getting at this reimagining of what would it be like if we don't just consider, even the term Anthropocene really puts humans at the center. The idea of humans and nature, that kind of separation. So some of her work in this piece in particular is really kind of challenging that. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. So maybe let me just, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some case studies that kind of into that in more detail, but let me just kind of pause there. Does anyone have any questions or comments or thoughts about what we talked about so far?
What did I miss? Hi.
You didn't miss very much. Basically just my introduction of who I am. That was about it. Yeah.
We'll rehash that over drinks.
Sorry?
We'll rehash that over drinks.
Sure. Yeah. Basically, techno, research, sound, music, sustainability is me. So, yes. Yeah. Which kind of boils down to that tattoo. So it's that's basically me. So the cases I'm going to talk about are, I'll also share the reference for the full paper we presented at the International Sustainability Transitions Conference in Utrecht at the end of August. And so myself, my colleague Josie Chambers, who's an assistant professor at Utrecht, and Joost, is he assistant or full? I can't remember, but anyway, he's at Utrecht as well. All three of us were involved in sound music sustainability, but in quite different ways. So we talked about three different cases. So the first one, this is the project that I presented a paper talking with where I met Katerina, called "Can You Hear the Earth Breathing?" So sorry, that picture is not really that great, but there on this side, I basically worked with a colleague to take climate change CO2 concentration data and translate that into MIDI, and then loaded the MIDI onto an SD card here, and then played that through the synthesizers. So you could hear the sound of the climate change rising, which by itself is not necessarily that interesting, but we actually played with a few different things looking at different time scales, because the data available you can get today, last week, last month, going all the way back to the last 800,000 years. And each of those data sets has different level of granularity and detail. Back to 1958, you can get very detailed data with measurements every 15 minutes. But going back that far in history, they're drilling down into ice cores in Antarctica, so you may have 100 years between data points and then 2,000 years between data points, and those times are just estimates, basically, anyway. So we're actually playing with multiple scales of that data. And also, in more recent performances, that's my collaborator, ERPSA, they're wearing a wireless microphone, so capturing the sound of their breath. And also, you can't really see it there, but wearing sensor pads on their skin, which measures the electrical resistance between the pads, which goes into the modular synthesizer and generates voltage, which I turn into pitch and gates and modulation. And then also There was about 6 plants around on stage, so EBSA would take them off the skin and put them on the plants. And I also find that interesting because getting back to subverting power, when we think about music, we think about rhythm and scale. Most popular music is very much based on Western conceptions of what is rhythm, what is scale. And of course, many, many cultures around the world have completely different understandings of tuning and scale and rhythm and meter and everything. So what the plants are generating is just raw voltage. That's not quantized to scale. The triggers that it's generating are not quantized to the beat. So I really like this idea of having, and Brian Eno calls his music a dance between control and surrender. So I really like that idea of having some things that are controlled and some things where you're just surrendering to the chaos. And especially on a techno dance floor where you've got a kick that's always on the beat, but then these things that are kind of floating around, but then the human brain will just take that and then lock it onto the beat and people will dance anyway. So I got kind of playing with that. But one of the reasons, so the paper that I presented when I met Katerina was on this idea of translation and disclosure. So I think for the people that are here, data sonification is not a new concept, right? You worked with that. So, but one of the things we were trying to get across to the audience was, what are the choices that are actually being made? Because if we tell the audience, hey, you're hearing the sound of climate change, on one hand, okay, yes, that's true. At the same time, we made choices on what data set are we going to use? How are we processing that data set? What is the upper note? How fast is it played back? Slow through a piano sound and climate change sounds nice and happy, or fast through a distorted metallic synth. And those choices are not good or bad. I mean, a violinist playing a solo in an orchestra, the conductor will make choices about tempo and what version. So those artistic choices it's not bad that we're making those choices, but how do we communicate that to the audience? So we played with a number of different ways where we had a video that was playing that showed the data download process, that showed the translation to MIDI, exporting that, recording that. We also had a printout that had a cast of characters that went through what are all the sounds you're hearing and where did that come from. And it was very well intentioned and really did not work. Instead of actually supporting the performance, it distracted people. People got confused when they saw things happening on the screen. They thought what was happening on the screen was actually a representation of what was happening live, even though it was just a recording. So we've kind of played around with some different versions. And last time we had the same video, but we had it playing on a loop in the background for 30 minutes before the performance started, with no narration, no audio. But at least there was like climate change curves and there was things happening. And then 30 seconds before the performance, we faded that to black, and then we started. So in that sense, we were sort of more priming people rather than sort of making it a lecture. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about a little bit later on that I'm very curious about. How do we integrate these sustainability messages into our music and continue to make it artistically interesting? There's lots of sort of more sustainable, we actually called it sustainability conference music, like, let's talk about the sustainable development goals, everything. Okay. So yes, it has a sustainability message, but it's not really that interesting artistically, aesthetically. But if you have something that's incredibly interesting artistically, aesthetically, and no one in the audience can understand anything about it and doesn't make any connection to sustainability, then how do we actually balance those things? So that's a lot of my work now is what is obvious and what are those moments of making things obvious, and then what are the moments where it can actually just be kind of part of the music. And I'll talk about that a bit later when I talk about this performance tonight. So that was one piece. The other one that Josie Chambers and her colleague Noor, they wrote a paper that was about, I can't imagine a more academic title from a paper, Co-Productive Agility for Sustainability Transformations. Basically, they were looking at different sort of patterns in how people respond and approach sustainability transitions and transformations. And one of the patterns they found was the hero, where you have the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezos, the sort of hero, that person is the one who's going to save us. Another one is the genie, where it's all very much a technocratic solution, that the COP meetings will save us, the scientists will save us. Another one is the woodpecker or the host where you're actually creating spaces where a whole bunch of different people can come together and sort of co-create solutions. So they wrote this paper, but in addition to the paper, instead of writing a text abstract, they wrote a song. And they convinced the journal to publish the song as a musical abstract. So they created themes that represented those different, they had a different motif for the hero, for the genie, for host, for woodpecker. And those themes actually come out and represent musically the ways that these different approaches to sustainability. So it was kind of an interesting approach, and both musically, but also thinking back to power of how much work they had to do just to convince the journal. If you're publishing academically, you know that depending on the journal, it's a fight to get anything, or maybe that's a bit too harsh. I was going to say anything interesting, definitely anything different through an academic publishing process. If you want to engage and recognize non-economic collaborators as co-authors, that can be problematic. If you want to use academic funding to pay non-academic people to be part of a process, that can be problematic. So there's all these kind of challenges that, even though every university has on their website saying, we're open, we engage with community, we participate, we partner, we collaborate, the reality is much more challenging and much different than that. So they were looking at really pushing the envelope on those. And then the third example is Joost, who sings in this black metal band. My Dutch is not very good. Traze de Roda, I think. And it's very much like kind of black metal music. And a lot of his work, both academically and with the band, is looking at the power of community and power in politics. So the black metal scene in particular has a long history, and certainly is from Scandinavia, of being associated with far-right and neo-Nazi and actual Nazi movements, and has actually been quite used effectively by those movements to engage youth, to sort of connect this idea of blood and belonging and land and ritual, and then basically funnel from the music into these kind of far-right movements. So a lot of what Joost, his band, and other bands in Utrecht in that community are thinking about, how do we reframe that? How do we actually use the power of ritual and community in music? So to actually have a different path, to a different way of actually connecting people from diverse backgrounds that can come together around this love of metal music. And he has a great photo of 5 Dutch politicians, basically ranging from far left to far right, with their arms around each other at one of these metal shows that don't agree on anything politically except for this love of metal music. And it provides a space for different people to come together. And in that one, they actually convinced the far right guy to leave his party as a result of those connections that were made over music. So I think that's an interesting example where the music is part of the sustainability story, but it's actually more about the community, about the space, about the sense of belonging. And if anybody remembers being a teenager, how strong that affinity is between if you're a metalhead or a goth or a raver or a rocker or whatever, that's who you are. That's who you are. And that power of identity and community can be very powerful in connecting to sustainability challenges, especially if we look at the power of community and identity in some of those areas that I talked about earlier, like in Germany, in the Ruhr, and in the Lausitz, where there's a very strong community feel, there's a very strong identity, there's a very strong connection to land, and also a very strong connection to coal, that people are proud to be a coal miner. Their father was a coal miner, their grandfather was a coal miner. People like me that drink flat white with oat milk, living in Berlin, telling them what to do and change their jobs. It's like, fuck that. So you have this, sorry, I'm not sure what the swearing rules are here, but thinking about, not to say that we need to make every sort of far-right person feel great, but if we don't understand the community and identity, it's very challenging to just tell people what to do. And I often give you this metaphor of, okay, so I'll use you as an example. So I'm not sure if you're in a relationship, but imagine if your partner said to you, okay, sorry, what's your name? Roman. Okay, so Roman, you're a great person, but can I tell you 10 things that if you changed about yourself, you'd be a much better partner? And now number one, so imagine, like, how well does that conversation go? Right? Like, no one wants to hear that conversation, but that's what a lot of sustainability messaging is. Fly less, recycle more, don't drive, take the bus. And at a certain point, people don't like being challenged, especially if it comes to not just little things like taking the bus, but your whole town needs to quit their jobs and do something different. That's a very difficult thing to actually tell people. And so it's not surprising when you get this resistance. So some of our reflections, that power of community and sense-making, navigating power structures. The other one that I'll just mention briefly there, this idea of embodiment. And this is another very powerful thing that I think about where music is something that we hear, but it really is just waves that are pushing out of the speakers. So certainly in club music, once it gets below 20 hertz, you can't hear it anymore, but you can feel it in your chest. You can actually feel the hairs in your arms stand up. So you're actually literally feeling and becoming part of the music. But embodiment can also be being in a space, being in a community, in a dance floor, in a metal show. It can also be the body being a part of the music, which is something that I play a lot with, often have. I don't have the module here, but the last set I played in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, I had a cable sort of running out here with a little clip on the end, and I would just wave someone up from the dance floor. They would put the clip on, which detects their heartbeat, so their heartbeat would be triggering a bass line, which I really enjoy because heartbeats are regular, but they're not exactly regular. And also, if I'm playing a techno set at 150 beats a minute, it would be really bad if someone's heartbeat was 150 beats a minute. So there's this kind of mismatch between the rhythm of the heart and the music, but it actually becomes part of that. So that's really interesting to kind of play with. That led us to some further research questions, which I'll come back to again a little bit later. So one is this evaluation, and we talked a lot about this as well. Katerina and I, we were thinking about this performance. How do you actually, what are the kind of questions, how will you actually evaluate how effective one of these, say, just using my sustainability techno set as an example, what does effective actually mean? I don't expect everyone that comes to the set at 3 in the morning and they're just all magically sustainable now. But what does it mean, and how do we evaluate those things? And how do we avoid what often happens in sustainability is that we measure the things that are easy to measure, tons of GHG reduced, number of jobs created, contribution to GDP, and if that's what we measure, then that's going to skew the kind of projects that we do. It's much harder to measure, are people now open and reimagining a different future? Are we actually moving to more just and inclusive society? Those things become more difficult to measure. Also balancing this instrumental in the non-musical sense. How do we really balance and avoid just recruiting artists to be marketers and PR people and communication specialists? And once again, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but that's not the only thing that artists are. And also this idea of the cognitive versus affective experience of the audience, which I mentioned earlier. How much are people consciously understanding? How much are they consciously picking up and noticing those things? And how much is it actually being part of the experience that they're just being affected by this, which connects back to the evaluation of how to connect to the value of those things. So just before I go into some of the projects that I'm working on now, any questions about those sort of, or thoughts around those sort of different levels or some of the cases that I talked about? Does it resonate with any? I'm curious if anyone has kind of been thinking along these lines about connecting sound and music and sustainability in their own work?
Actually, the reason why I'm here is I'm coming a bit from the other side, doing energy transition traditionally in a technical sense, and figuring that it's not solving the project, the problem. So I'm very intrigued, as you know, we've been talking about how we can bring projects together and use music as a way of imagining change, because that's the feeling I have is the biggest hurdle we have, that, as you said before, it's very hard to imagine true change. You know, we're thinking incrementally, but the energy transition is not going to happen incrementally. We need a radical change, I think, and that's where I connect to your ideas, and it's very intriguing to me.
Interesting. Great. Any other thoughts? Okay, cool. All right, well, I'm just going to go through relatively quickly through some of the projects, and this is, I'm not going to go into a deep dive on these, Most of them already have video and that kind of stuff you can check out, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the different ways of approaching that. So I mentioned the International Sustainability Transitions Conference. So this is us on stage doing a performance to open the conference. And actually this was the earliest sound check I've ever done. We were there at 7 a.m. to get started. Usually if I'm doing a sound check at 7, it's because the party has been going all night. But this opened the conference at 9. And we actually created a piece that represented musically different ways of disruption. We had Joost doing one of his metal screams, that's him with a little heartbeat clip on there. Josie was singing lyrics that were based on words that did not show up in the abstracts. So migrant, feeling, refugee, fear, things that were not in the abstracts for the paper. And a big piece that we were trying to approach was this idea of music as something that can spark feeling. Because for sustainability professionals and actually most academics, feeling and emotion is not really something that's supposed to be in our work and not what we publish, which is kind of odd because if we kind of look at the world around us and we don't feel confused, if we don't feel angry, if we don't feel scared, if we don't feel hopeful, that would be strange if we didn't feel something. So that's one of the ways that music can connect with that. And we also did a workshop where we talked about different music, sound, sustainability. We let people play around with different tools, and I'll show you a video of that in a second. And then I also did a live techno set at the conference party at a club in Utrecht. And just to give you an idea of, this is what our workshop actually turned into. So all these sounds are actually just being produced by people that showed up at the workshop. And it was surprising that someone started dancing in our workshop at an academic conference. So one of the reasons I wanted to show that is that for a lot of people, certainly in an academic world, consulting, technocratic world, there's a lot of, what I've seen is there's a lot of pent-up desire for feeling and expression. One way, some ways to actually express the emotions we're feeling and connect with that, and making that kind of more okay to be part of the work that we do. Another piece that I do is looking at sustainable techno. As I mentioned, I got permission from Bruno Latour's office before he passed away to use one of his lectures in one of my tracks. So I use different sort of sustainability pieces a lot, but usually in the tracks, the vocals are a little bit buried. There's lots of reverb and delay and distortion on them. It's not like just listening to something. So it's not, and there's a lot of heavy kicks. So it's not like people are just standing on the dance floor sort of listening. But every single time afterwards, what was that? Was there like a French guy talking about something? Or why did you have a plant on stage? And it gives a chance to kind of spark that conversation. So an example of that at this set here. Did I get the right clip with the vocals? So, unfortunately, I missed the part that one actually had samples of 3 different lectures that at the beginning, they were all playing together and stacked on each other, so it was really unintelligible. You couldn't hear anything going on, but then they sort of separated into 3 different movements, which I found interesting because in that case, the people in the audience were actually sustainability academics that knew who these people actually were, which is another thing, thinking about venues. One of the reasons why I like doing and bringing this into music, and I think a big power, is that at a sustainability conference or an event that's billed as sustainable music or an Earth Day event, generally the people that come there are already kind of the people that are converted. They're there because they want to hear about sustainability and climate things. If you think about an average metal show or an average electronic show or an average festival, there's a lot of people there that care about sustainability, and a lot of people that don't, a lot of people that don't know, it becomes a really interesting way to bring this message into a new audience rather than talking to the same people that already believe, that are already kind of converted. So yeah, this is the project I mentioned. That's the paper that I presented at that conference. Yeah, I won't talk about that. Yeah, this is a photo from last month from our latest performance. And that's Arab Sir kind of literally kind of crawling on the ground. You can see the wires where there's the one pad that's connected to the plant. So she's actually, it actually turns into kind of cool because since she's got the microphone, it's kind of almost like a trio where the plant is generating voltages, which is playing back to the synthesizer. And then Arab Sir is actually harmonizing along with those notes. And then they're actually stroking and manipulating the plant, which is changing the notes. So you actually have this interaction between the human and the non-human. And a lot of her dance work is about this idea of decentering the human. How do we actually think about to the point where Ebsa didn't actually want her face as a biophoto on the promotion and just having a plant image instead. And then, yeah, these are a couple of examples from, this was in Amsterdam. So in this one, yeah, the cables actually ran out at the back, so I was just clipping onto the tulip leaves and another synthesizer. This one here, you can't quite see, but that black cable there is the ground, which actually literally goes into the dirt, so it makes it grounding the circuit. So in this, and then the other wires, like these alligator clips here, clip on to the one end of the synth and the other end of the plant leaves. And in that design, the plant itself actually becomes part of the circuit. So in that case, the plant is not playing the music, you still have to touch the tones, but the plant is actually integrated into the resistance and of the synthesizer. So depending on the plant, the time of day, the amount of water content in the leaves, how much water is in the soil, that will actually affect the resistance and change the circuit. So in that sense, with the other one, the plant is actually generating sounds. Here the plant is more affecting the kind of sound that's being made. Another project that we did a few weeks ago in Berlin, as part of Berlin Science Week, was called Quantum Inspired Sound. That's my partner, Anya. She's a professor of theoretical quantum physics. Actually, which kind of funny was when we first started dating, she sent me a screenshot of one of her lecture slides. And the title of the slide said, "Let's start with something simple." And I didn't understand anything on the slide. I was like, can you send me the slide that's before or starting with something simple? So we organized an event and paired 3 quantum physics research groups with 3 sound artists with very little instruction. Basically commissioned to create something that is inspired by either quantum physics concepts or experimental data or field recordings in the lab. So Anya and I did a sonic lecture. So she had the chalkboard there, and there's a contact microphone on the chalkboard picking up the sound of the chalk clicks, and her voice all going into my synthesizers. And I was responding to different ideas of filters and feedback and amplifiers, because I didn't realize that those quantum physicists, they're using exactly the same stuff as this. They're using oscillators, but their oscillators are gigahertz frequencies. They're using amplifiers and filters, but they're cooled down in these big cryostat tanks to just above absolute zero. But it's exactly the same thing, so we were playing with that. And then Thomas actually did 3 sort of separate short pieces that was actually created a new scale based on some of the quantum jump experimental data and used that data to generate a new scale that he played. And then Jeanette was playing with the idea of feedback and resonance. So she had 2 big 1 meter by 2 meter metal plates that were hanging from the ceiling. Each one had 4 electric motors, so she would make them vibrate, and then microphones to connect to catch the resonance and feedback. So the resonators that the physicists use are about 2 millimeters long by 1 millimeter wide. So she was just basically blowing that up 10,000 times. So that was a pretty cool performance. A next one that'll be starting next year in May, I think we'll be starting this in Gothenburg, is this idea of using sound for future visioning. So this idea came about talking about quiet. So if you ask people, they'll often say they want to live in a quiet neighborhood, but quiet they don't mean silent. They still want to hear the sound of kids playing, birds in the trees, glasses clinking at the cafe, people laughing in the park. So the idea here, we've picked 3 neighborhoods with the city of Gothenburg that are slated for pretty intense urban redevelopment over the next few years. and we'll do like a small workshop and ask people to go out into the neighborhood with their phones and record sounds they want to hear more of in the future and sounds they want to hear less of in the future. And then I'll collect that and create a soundscape for a public performance and also use that as a workshop. So instead of having typical maps and charts and 3D renderings, we'll actually use sound as a way to facilitate a conversation about the future. And then the people at City of Gothenburg, they want to do that and then come back 2 years from now or 2 years from then after that development is done to kind of compare what do the soundscapes actually sound like and how does that compare to what was there at the beginning in 2024, and also how does that compare to the future soundscape that people want to create. So that'll be starting soon. And then another one that just started, so actually this Wednesday just launched this radio show, Sustain on RBL, which is a community online radio station. So this first episode was an hour long that had interviews with Josie and Dan and Joost and Noor talking about that project as well as excerpts from the performance. So the idea of this is I'm by no means the only person that is thinking about sound and music and sustainability. There's lots of interesting artists that are doing that. So the idea of the show is to highlight those artists, talk to them, highlight their music, interview them, share those kind of stories and get that more broadly. And also doing that with in-person workshops, giving some training to artists that may want to do things around sustainability but don't necessarily have the technical skills in different ways. So we did this workshop in October. IRA, they did a workshop on producer to perform for under 10 euros because not everybody has enough cash to actually buy all this stuff. So what can you do with free software, open source? What if you only have a phone? Well, you can actually do a lot just on your phone. Katerina was talking about sonification and field recording. Felipe talking about spatial audio. A lot of his work is this idea of how can you kind of reimagine listening and what does listening to the future look like? So playing with feedback and spatial. He would go nuts in this room. And then Jackie talking about DIY. How can you actually create instruments based on what you find in the trash? But also talking a lot about improvisation as a metaphor for how we respond to the future. There's a lot of sustainability plans. City plans are very much a kind of a command and control structure. Okay, we're here today. We know what the future is. We'll do these plans. We'll put these things in. We'll build the dams. We'll build all these kind of things. But nature is not like a nice little incremental step thing. There's floods and hurricanes and so the idea of improvisation. How can we become more resilient, more adaptive? How can we improvise? How can we actually change as the world starts to change? And I found a great example of that coming from the UK, where all of their rail lines, all of the steel or iron or whatever it is certified to be safe at a maximum temperature of 35 degrees Celsius. Because 100 years ago, that was like really extreme. Now there's actually quite a few days in the UK each year that are above 35, where basically the rail lines can't run anymore. So you're just trying to imagine like how many kilometers of rail lines are there in Austria or the UK or Germany? What does it actually mean to rip those up? I think that's an example of it. We set a fixed target. So I don't know what it would look like to be flexible, but how do we think about that in a more flexible way? And then we also had live performances. And then I also do live performance workshops, teaching people about more of the concepts, how to play live on stage, how to do storytelling, how to do composition, how to do mixing, sound checks, all that kind of stuff. But again, I bring those sustainability themes into those workshops. People don't come to the workshops because of sustainability. They come because they want to play a live techno on stage, but it's another opportunity for me to spread those messages. And I've done that in Amsterdam, and Barcelona, and Utrecht, and Berlin, and a few other places. We're on time. Okay. So in terms of a research side, I'm not going to go too much into this, but are people generally familiar with like this kind of conception of artistic research? And okay, so this is this idea of research in the arts and using the arts to actually explore and learn and create is something that I really engage with, because one of the papers that I saw recently this paper doesn't have anything to do with music at all. It's just about how humans think about themselves in relationship to the environment. And they have this 4 sort of concepts of living from, living in, living with, and living as. With historically living from and living in this case wetlands, is a very anthropocentric. So wetlands and nature is a resource. How do we actually extract those resources and use those to humans' benefit? That humans have been doing that for a long time. All of colonial life was based on that idea, extracting resources from nature to do something with it. Living in also means, okay, how do we actually move into this environment? How do we live there? How do we preserve our way of life in that environment? But then they're proposing more ideas of a more bioecocentric is living with. How do we think of ourselves as not just taking our existing way of life, plopping it into the wetland, but what would it look like to live in harmony where humans are just one of many species that are living in that wetland. But what I find most interesting is this idea of living as. What would it mean to actually be living as with the wetland being part of us? Not just sort of living, like thinking that we're stepping into this, but water and air and nature are actually part of us. The dirt is actually part of us. And this is where I have this up here because I think this is a perfect example of where art and music can actually help us explore that. Because intellectually, living as wetland as part of us, okay, what does that actually mean? But as a visual artist, as a sculptor, as a painter, as a poet, as a musician, to me that would be an amazing spark to kind of create. What would that actually look like, whether it's using, or what would that feel like, what would that sound like? So some of my work is exploring some of those kind of questions. And I did a workshop at Utrecht University, and these are some of the research questions we're looking to explore further. I'll just pick maybe some of these we talked about already. I think we've talked about all those. But one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out how do we actually find the connections between the people that are interested in doing this research, the artists, the musicians that are creating this, and also there was one of the ones there, so that fourth one there, this idea of framing as artistic interventions. So when we were presenting the paper at the Transitions Conference, a lot of the questions that we got from the audience were people asking, so I'm doing this artistic intervention in this project. What do you think about doing A, B, or C? And I found that a very interesting framing because most artists, certainly I don't think about, when I'm playing a live techno set, I don't think about that as an artistic intervention in a research project. I'm playing techno. I'm just making music. But as a researcher, people thinking about, okay, what is this intervention into this kind of community? How are we actually using that in the same way we would use a survey or education campaign or a social media campaign, in which case music just becomes one of many other things. So that's an interesting thing to explore. What does it mean to frame art and music as an engaging, aesthetic, communal experience versus framing it as an artistic intervention that's designed to actually achieve a specific goal? Once again, those are not necessarily right or wrong or good or bad, but it definitely changes the way we approach the art and the research. Which leads finally, and this is, I'll wrap up. Actually, we're not doing too bad on time. So just before I go into this performance, any other questions or thoughts on what went through that far? All right. So, are all of you living here in Graz? Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the city because you know the city, you know this. So this is actually, it's an interesting example of how these ideas emerge. So when I sort of first pitched the idea and I applied for this artistic research residency, I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was more or less, I'll do something with data and then kind of figure out what that was. But as we talk more and more, okay, what kind of data? What are we actually going to do? And it was actually through our conversations that I actually learned about this. So this was from Wednesday when I took this screenshot on my phone, and just thinking about the environment, the geography, the weather systems, those different things that contribute to the air quality. And that was one of the ideas that really sparked, okay, maybe we could use that kind of data and actually thinking about how are we actually measuring these different things and what does that actually do. And the other thing that sort of sparked from an artistic side was this idea of maybe moving away from being quite so obvious. With the climate change data, it was every data point triggered a note, and the pitch of the note was a representation of the value of CO2. And it was kind of cool, but it was like pretty obvious. You could hear the da-da-da-da-da, and it was actually interesting artistically. But with this one, I was interested in the idea of moving a little bit farther away from that, where the air is all around us, and it's surrounding us. We're always affected by these different things, but unless the level actually gets up to here, we don't actually notice it. But it's always affecting our lungs, our brains, our well-being, our health. But we usually actually don't notice that unless it gets really bad, or unless you're actually right beside a diesel engine and you're seeing the smoke come out, or you're standing in front of a factory where you see the smog or the haze over the city. So that was kind of the idea of sort of playing with those things. And that actually kind of sparked, so this is basically how I kind of started thinking about what are some of the ideas and themes. So when we think about dust and we think about air, grains, transformation, shadow, invisible, unwanted, drift, storm, dust, cycles, particles. So I started playing and thinking about what would those ideas sort of be more an aesthetic side. What is the feel of shadow? What is the feel of dust? What's the feel of a storm? But also thinking about what are the kind of instruments and tools that I have. When I'm thinking about particles and grains, I start thinking immediately of granular synthesis and sort of splitting sounds up into little particles and kind of playing with those. When I think about clouds or storms and drift, I think about modulation, how things are sort of drifting over time and sort of changing. When I'm thinking about unwanted, I'm thinking about feedback, distorted sounds, dissonant sounds that in kind of normal music, we don't want to hear any of that. But what is it like when we actually hear some of those things? So, think about the data. So in terms of the sonification of the data, really what you'll hear tonight is very much data as modulation. So none of the sounds you hear, none of the pitches will be from the data. None of the sounds will be triggered by those data points. But the data will be affecting everything through either modulating delay times or modulating filter cutoffs or frequency modulation of oscillators in a way that sometimes will be more or less obvious. And using both the raw and only one piece of manipulated data, but also playing with this idea of order and surrender, where in this particular piece, some of the samples are pre-prepared, some of the drum sounds are pre-prepared, but only on one track, only one drum pattern is actually programmed. So all of that will be improvised and developed. None of the sequencer patterns are pre-programmed, so everything will be developed kind of improvised basis, which I enjoy, but it's also, it'll be interesting to kind of play because I shouldn't make that assumption. I'm going to assume that you'll stay for the end of the performance. But at a club, it's actually immediate feedback. People either dance or they don't. They're dancing or they're looking at the phones. They stay on the dance floor or they leave to get a drink. So it's an immediate kind of reaction of how far can I push into the surrender where it's still interesting, but at a certain point, if it's total chaos and it lasts too long, people leave because they can't dance anymore. But if it's too controlled and too repetitive, it gets really, really boring, and also people leave because it's just boring, just the same beat over and over again. So in terms of the data sources, there's this is actually where we got the data. All the data is from Graz North, and we actually played with basically, that's where the data sources are. So these are we also played with the different data time periods. So looking at which we kind of had to play with because depending on the data value that we wanted and depending on the time on the date range we wanted, that actually affected what the granularity of the data was that we'd actually get. So 2008 to 2023 is monthly data. The last 365 days is daily. the last 3 months, hourly, 2014 to 2022 is daily, and then just, we just wanted to see if there was any kind of spark on New Year's Eve when everybody sets off their firecrackers and everything, and that is, data every half hour. So basically kind of going through a translation process, first of all, kind of cleaning up and extracting the data. So in this case here, that's nitrous dioxide and PM10, which is particular matter that's larger than 10 microns. So basically extracting that from the data that's been downloaded. Then actually, just doing a quick kind of check to look at what does that raw data look like? What is that relative set of values that when you download it, just basically like a big spreadsheet. And then another process of kind of looking at here, what are the actual ranges? Because in this particular case, we're translating the data into MIDI. So we need to kind of look at, based on which data set, what is a scaling factor that we're actually going to use to do that translation. So looking at what are the minimum values and the maximum values. Then doing another sort of little map to kind of see what was the data actually looking like, and then finally doing the mapping of taking that data and mapping it to control voltages, or to CC messages, in MIDI. So and then basically taking, this is what the raw MIDI file looks like in Ableton, just like any other MIDI file. So the data values we're actually using, it is sending a pitch value, but we're not using that for pitch, and also velocity, also using breath, which is CC value 2, and mod wheel, which is CC value 1. So I'll just go through this kind of quickly, but and so this is kind of what it looks like in the Ableton file. So you can see those are how the different data sets are lined up. So during the performance, usually I don't have a computer in my performance, but I couldn't find a good way to actually have something that could actually play back MIDI files at the resolution that I wanted. The module that I have here will play back MIDI files, but will only output 2 values, which is usually pitch and gate. I wanted more than that. You can record MIDI into the Octatrack, but it also has limitations on, there's a certain, I think it's 128 steps is the limit for one loop in the pattern. So I couldn't actually have that many data points. So during the performance, the laptop will connect here, which is sending MIDI in, but there won't be any audio coming from the laptop, just the MIDI going into the system. I'm not going to go through all of these, but that's basically what it looks like. So with this particular data set, that's what the data looks like, and we've mapped particulate matter 2.5 microns to pitch, nitrous dioxide, so it should be nitrogen dioxide to velocity, rainfall in millimeters to mod, and air temperature to breath. I'm not going to go through all of these because they're basically just different mappings. But basically what it actually does, it goes into this module here, which is basically converts MIDI to control voltage. So actually, are you guys familiar with, okay. Are you guys familiar with modular synthesis and what control voltage means? Okay, not everybody's nodding their head. So basically, between 0 and 10 volts, 0 is a low note, 10 volts is a high note, and 1 volt per octave is what goes in the pitch. And usually if you're triggering a sound, if the voltage is 0, nothing will happen. If it gets a spike at 5 volts, that'll trigger a drum sound or something like that. So basically, it goes in here, and I've got these different cables, and each of these cables is sending out one of those different values. So for example, this one might be, actually just another one with, so this one might be humidity, which is coming from a velocity, and this one might be rainfall, which is coming through a mod. But the reason I wanted to do it this way is that the nice thing about modular synthesizers, once I have this cable, like even if this cable is meant to be pitch, I can plug it anywhere. It doesn't need to be pitch. It's just a changing level of voltages. So I've got 2 of the voltages that are going raw straight out, which actually have a lot of the values are actually kind of stepped. Like there, you can see they're not a smooth curve. So 2 of the values are going to be those step level changes, and the other 2 are going through a slew limiter, which basically smooths out the curve, so they're more smoother transitions between each data point. And yeah, so in terms of, I'll just do all these here. So in terms of actually what I've got, and yeah, after the talk, you're more than welcome to come up and take a look at the stuff. So I've got, yeah, the octatrack, which is basically playing back a couple of samples. It's acting as the main clock, sending MIDI into here and then into here. Actually, sorry, into here. Actually, another thing, the computer and this are running the same tempo, but are not synchronized in clock. So the modulations are actually not exactly on the same as the rhythm. The analog rhythm for the beats, the Borderlands granular synth app, which have you played with? Anyone played with that? It's pretty cool. Basically, you can kind of see there's 4 different wave files. In each little circle, you can set the number of grains of sound that you're going to hear and whether they overlap, whether they play forward or backward. And since it's an iPad, you can actually manipulate that all at the same time. Then I've got a few different synths, the EOWave Swarm, Bastille Instruments Soft Pop, and then Air Instruments Cloud Busting. And all 3 of them have elements of, I mean, even just the name Swarm, and they also have a bit of, this has some granular and some noise stuff. I've also got some noise and dust particle things in there. And then also some of the samples were made with an Ableton plugin called Dust, which is a granular synth plugin that is also kind of fun to play with. It kind of almost uses the idea of gravity, so you can kind of send a stream of, like you can have a sample, and it breaks the sample down into grains, and it kind of shoots the stream of grains into the screen, and you can create different gravity points that sort of attract and kind of make different sounds. So it's pretty fun to play with. Yeah, and this was downstairs in the office. That's kind of basically the flow of the performance. But yeah, so I talked about that. So it's very much I like doing these planned compositions along with the kind of planned improvisation. So I have an idea. So the structure is already in place. I know definitely because I want to be able to bring that story in. There's certain moments, but all of what these cables are actually going to plug into, what sounds are going to come in, what order that happens, what notes are going to be played, all that, what the drum patterns are going to be. I kind of improvise that on the fly. I was also interested in playing with this idea of the unknown effects of the data and modulation, is that for some of the data sets, I know exactly what kind of modulation, what kind of curve that represents, and I have a pretty good idea in my head about what that's going to do to the sound. Other ones I don't, and other ones I deliberately did not actually look in too much detail at, because I wanted to be able to have that experience of responding to the data and actually experimenting, plugging different things in, actually seeing what kind of sounds good in the moment. And yeah, this bit about the unusual venue, it's an amazing sound system, but yeah, I'll be curious to see what it feels like to actually play a techno set. It'll be like roughly 45 minutes. Yeah, and hopefully maybe we can move the chair. So even if people are not dancing, it'd be nice if we were at least standing rather than sitting down in chairs. That would be kind of an odd feeling. And yeah, maybe if anyone has like a strobe light app on their phone, they can set that off in the corner and we can have a dance floor kind of feel. So yes, that's kind of basically what I want to walk through. Yeah, so that was kind of like a bit of how I've been thinking about approaching sound music and sustainability, giving kind of those different possibilities. I think it's really exciting, both from, you mentioned the need for radical change, and back to Billy Bragg again, he said, one of his quotes recently, he said he didn't think that music can necessarily change the world, but music can make people believe that it's possible for the world to change. And I think that was an interesting idea that, if we start to give up and that we're on a path and it's not going to change, then if no one makes any change, then nothing's going to change. So think about how we can engage with that. But also lots of really interesting research questions, I think, still to explore on how do we do that? What works? What doesn't? In which communities? So I'm hoping to explore that further. So happy to work. So that's basically all I had now. We definitely have some time for questions, and then I'll take a short break, rearrange things a little bit, and then I'll do the performance at 8 o'clock. And I know some people might have to leave, but I hope people can stick around for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions at the moment? Yes, please.
Are you using techno as a sort of common language?
Am I using techno as sort of a common language?
It's a very connoted music, and also it has in its ideology everything you talked about from the beginning. So that's why I was actually asking this question. That is like about multi-layered.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't have described it as that my intent, but I think you're right. I mean, I think so. I love doing experimental sound out performances, and maybe the common language for me comes back to the audience. That so this is a typical audience size for an experimental sound out performance. That people are kind of quite into a particular scene. Dance music in general tends to have a wider variety of people. That some people are there because they really want to see that DJ. Other people love that club. Other people are just, well, it's Saturday night, I want to go out. So that's, for me, that kind of commonality of that piece. I definitely do like reflecting back and connecting and thinking about what is that history that we're actually kind of building on? Where did these beats actually come from? How do we actually recognize the past when we're still kind of making a future? So I think that's kind of interesting. But I really like that phrase. I hadn't thought about it with that. But that definitely is why I like doing this in environments that are not advertised as sustainability focused, and kind of coming more into those different environments. So, yeah.
Perhaps let me ask one question about, I still think about this effectivity and in how far are we now primed, because we saw this talk.
Right.
We think about fine dust and everybody living in Graz knows fine dust and this idea. So this will make it a very different experience than playing it to an audience that does not know it,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's we talked a little bit about that. I'd love to do multiple versions of the performance. So assume we had a set of questions of what did you think, what did you learn, what did you experience, what did you feel, those kind of typical kind of after event survey questions. Yeah, it'd be great to do an event like this where there was this level of content up front and then the performance, and then the following night do it the other way around, have the performance first and then have an artist talk, and then a third night just have the performance, no artist talk, and sort of see what are the different levels of interaction. But I think it also, that really raises a big methodological question of what do we actually want to measure? So is it about raising awareness that the air quality in Graz can be bad? I think a lot of people here that live in the city already know it, so do you need a techno set to communicate that? Is it more about building a shared sense of community that together we're actually aware of something, we can actually make some changes happen? Is it about more of an education? Is it actually not about that at all? Is it more just about using this as an interesting aesthetic hook to actually build a community of people that could actually continue that community and do something else going forward? I think all of those have a lot of value. Which I think to get to, was it effective or the affect? I think we need to think about, like, why do we actually want to make that piece happen? So, I mean, for me personally, I think there's a lot of value in sparking that kind of communication and sparking community and fostering dialogue. So the first time I played this piece the second time I played it solo in Berlin, there was no introduction at all. It was just I was the first act, and I kind of played it. There was no video. That was not a conscious choice. I just couldn't get the projector working in time, and I had to play. I played for 35 minutes. And I just went outside for a cigarette and sat down at a picnic table outside the club. And within 10 minutes, there was 12 people sitting down, having a conversation about sound and music and sustainability and climate change and engagement. I didn't invite them, I didn't mean that, but it just sort of, by providing that spark, it gave a reason for people to come together and talk. So I think there's value in that. But back to my dissertation, one of the titles of my chapters was, is talking making any difference? So it's great to get people to talk and build community, but then what happens next? So, but that's where I think there's a lot of, if that's kind of designed intentionally, there can be ways to sort of harvest sort of, what happens next? How do we keep that community going? How do we sort of keep those conversations going? So, yeah.
So if there are no questions now, let's keep conversations going.
Yes.
Thank you again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Looking forward to the performance.
Well, cool. Thanks very much. Thank you.